Go. So hello, greetings everybody. Good evening from Berlin, from Hertie School, the University of Governance in Berlin, and to our new series of talks, Democracy Promotion After Afghanistan. This is the second talk in this new line of events that we organize here at Hertie School. And we are really very proud to have with us two outstanding scholars. We have the renowned democracy scholar Larry Diamond from Stanford and the Hoover Institution. And we have the economist, but I think more recently really has turned into a democracy scholar himself, Professor Sergei Guriev from Sciences Po in Paris. What we were planning to discuss tonight is less the situation of a certain country and less the situation of the democracy in general, but continuing our general line of inquiry. We started with Afghanistan last time with really the situation of Afghanistan and the contribution of corruption of international development to the way Afghanistan turned out. And now what I would like to do is to travel from the causes of the current situation to the possible solutions which exist. Because these solutions seem to be very different from the solutions of my youth. I was 25 in 1989 when the Berlin Wall fell, and I was one of the people who were, empowered by these changes, who was a democracy activist in Eastern Europe in a very hopeful situation. So I guess that, my first puzzle that I would like our guests to reflect upon is really, why does context seem so bad today compared to 1989? I mean, after all, in 1989, we still have quite a significant part of the world which was under Soviet influence. We still had, despite their defeat in Afghanistan, a very strong Soviet Union. In many ways, China, had just repressed people in Tiananmen, so we actually knew that China was strong. And still the feeling was, each time that people were going in the street somewhere, the feeling was that they were on the side of history, or history was on their side, whatever you want to put it. And we really do not have this kind of feeling today, right? We really have really more, we are apprehensive when people go into the street in Egypt or in Algeria or in Belarus, and we are really concerned that we're afraid this is going to turn out badly, and that's not much that we can do for these people. So what is accountable for this very, very dramatic and unfavorable change of international context when democracy is concerned? Larry, I would really start with you, because I know people ask you this from morning till night, and 10,000 are the questions, considering you the guru of this democracy phenomenon. So please tell us your thoughts first.
Good. Thank you, Alina, and it's a pleasure to be with you and Sergei. I think that we first need to start with a proper comparative assessment. Levels of freedom and democracy in the world are better today than they were in 1989. That is, if you just take a snapshot of the status of regimes, the number of democracies, and the average level of political rights and civil liberties on the Freedom House Index, or similar measures on the varieties of democracy index, the world as a snapshot today is much freer and more democratic than it was in 1989. What's dispiriting about the current situation is the trend line, the direction, the momentum, and that represents the thrust of your conversation or your question, of this conversation and your question. In 1989 was a moment of surprise, but then of immense hope once the wall fell and freedom burst forward, and so many democracies quickly came into being and gained their footing. 1989 represented tremendous forward momentum for liberal values and for democracy, and a strong climate of confidence, particularly once it happened, about the future of democracy. And so I think what's different now are multiple things, but these are some that come to my mind. First of all, back then, the principal impediment geopolitically to freedom and democracy in the world was the Soviet Union. And it was still there in 1989. It wouldn't be there all that much longer, but it was still there. And the Soviet Union was a decaying authoritarian empire, which had only 2 years of life left to it. And it had a leader who was not a Democrat in Mikhail Gorbachev, but who was exercising restraint and who had kind of invited some of this with his policies of perestroika and glasnost. And there was already ferment underway intellectually and politically in the Soviet Union, say by the fall of 1989, and it greatly accelerated after the fall of the dictatorships of Central and Eastern Europe. So that's the first difference. The second difference is that China may have repressed several months earlier, as you note, in Tiananmen Square, brutally, the protests for greater freedom and accountability and political choice and control and so on. But it wasn't a major power. It didn't have geopolitical weight or influence as any kind of potential superpower. That still lurked far off in the future. And the third thing was that the US was strong. It was strong at home and strong abroad. It had outspent and out-innovated the Soviet Union in a military race and had kind of helped to break it economically in that competition during the 1980s. And we weren't yet, we would be very soon at the unipolar moment once the Soviet Union disappeared. But by the fall of 1989, there were no longer two superpowers of equal strength. There was a resurgent, self-confident, creative, maybe sometimes over intervening and overbearing, but geopolitically strong and self-confident United States, leading an informal circle of democracies, and a Soviet Union that, once its East European satellites fell, was in an advanced state of decay. And then we need to add as well several other things, but I'll just mention two so that I don't monopolize this. There were two other things that had not happened yet that would happen. One was the model of authoritarian success, developmental transformation under a, I would say, neo-totalitarian regime in China. Deng Xiaoping and his reform and opening was, just about a decade into its transformative record of generally 10% annual economic growth, was beginning to attract attention and resonate elsewhere in the world. But of course, the Tiananmen crackdown diminished that. And social media was nowhere to be seen. And when you add up all the things that did not exist in 1989 that exist now, including the latter two, and China's immense ability to project ideological and geopolitical soft and sharp, not to mention hard power, the relative weakness and retreat of the United States, our own divisions and loss of self-confidence, some of the same in Europe, the fact that now Iraq and Afghanistan have happened, and 15 years later, neither worked out very well, but Afghanistan by now, particularly disastrously. And it's just a transformed, and not in a good way, of course, geopolitical environment.
Okay, I see. So the winners of the Cold War are actually not feeling well presently, and the losers of the Cold War seem to be, have increased confidence, even if in Russia, as we were discussing before we start, they really have a lot of excess deaths of COVID, showing that, they are not so different a country from the time when they were a weak state. But, I take your point, and I think we should remain with this, that in fact, we do have a lot of countries which were conquered for democracy, but the countries where people still fight unsuccessfully were the most difficult cases. And this is why it's not so easy to win such cases. It was never easy to win Belarus, but look how many other countries, around Russia, nevertheless, have made it. So why are these, losers of the Cold War? Why did they win the peace, Sergei? What happened? Is this explanation political, or is a lot of, actually a lot of economics explain the success of Russia and China 30 years later?
Thank you very much, Alina, and thank you for inviting me, organizing this. It's a pleasure and honor to be here on this panel together with Larry. And since you mentioned Afghanistan, I would say 89 for me in Soviet Union. I had different problems. My main problem was that Afghan war was still continuing. It actually ended in 99. And for people of my generation, I wasn't 18, the age at which they would draft people to the army. The issue was actually to choose a career where chances to be drafted would be lower. So it is a completely different set of circumstances. Today, you mentioned that I'm free to choose the discipline that I want to study, the subject of study, and that doesn't have life or death consequences for me. In that sense, my life has improved immensely after not just disintegration of Soviet Union, but also the end of the Afghan war.
So now, you at least have won the peace following the Cold War
yes,
individually.
Yes.
Exactly. No, the cold peace. You are definitely.
I know Mike McFall's book. Yes, the hot peace, he calls it. Yes. Now I fully agree with Larry, and I think we should start with setting the things straight. Level of democracy today is much higher than in 89 or at any point in history. We've had ups and downs in the last 10 years. You can say democratic recession or stagnation, but overall number of people living under democracy, a number of countries living under democracy, the number of very brutal regimes, all of that is as good as never been in history before. The trends are worrisome, I fully agree. But I would also say that, yes, China offers an alternative. I fully agree with Larry that this is something that we've not seen for 20 or 30 years. China today offers an alternative model. It's still not a model that people want to imitate. Young people from America don't emigrate to China. But still, it says that I have hard power, I have soft power, my growth rates are higher. And in that sense, China, especially in recent years when it started to invest so much in advanced technology, including artificial intelligence, that is something that may be something new. Other technological breakthroughs were all made in free countries because for innovation, you need competition and freedom. Artificial intelligence is the technology where big data are important. And collecting big data in autocracies is much easier than in democracies where privacy still matters and is protected. And in that sense, we should be worried that AI may actually be benefiting from Chinese non-democratic model. And then Chinese dictatorial state may benefit from advanced AI technology. And in that sense, this is something that may explain what has happened. I also fully agree with Larry on social media. Social media has contributed to the rise of populism, to polarization in advanced economies, and in that sense made the West weaker. And the weakness, the internal weakness of the West contributes to relative success of autocracies, including Russia, which per se, of course, doesn't offer any good, attractive model compared to China or the West. Now, this is something that I would like to mention. You said that I'm working on new generations of dictators, on spin dictators, together with Dan Trisman. We wrote this book, which is coming up in March in Princeton University Press. So China is separate, but a lot of other dictatorships are a bit like Russia, where they pretend to be democracies. They pretend to run elections, pretend to have opposition, independent media. And the reason for that, they know that this manipulative model is better suited for today's world. This may worry us that these countries remain dictatorships and kind of survive and resist democratic movements at home and abroad. On the other hand, it also reassures us that Russia is not offering an alternative model like it was in '89. Turkey is not offering an alternative model. Within Europe, you have Hungary, which also pretends to be a democracy, right? So in that sense, by the very fact that these countries imitate the winners of the Cold War, that suggests that they don't have a radically different developmental socioeconomic model. Now, when you ask me about economics, I would say there are several things which also contributed to relative internal weakness of the West, and these were the crisis of 2008, 2009, and subsequent austerity, especially in Europe, that really weakened the support for the status quo, for the mainstream political parties. The other thing is, of course, the secular trend of globalization and technological development, robotization, automation, which leaves many people behind in the US. And that also creates a fertile ground for populists. All this weakness is actually quite problematic. And another thing is, of course, complacency. Larry mentioned the unipolar world of 1990s. I strongly support the thesis of Frank Fukuyama, Larry's colleague, that the history did end in the 1990s, in the sense that you don't have alternatives to liberal democracy. Well, China may now emerge as one, but definitely Nazism and Bolshevism are gone and radical Islam is very limited. But on the other hand, this very complacency that there is no alternative resulted in inability or lack of willingness to actually fight those, as you said, losers of the Cold War pretending to be democracies. Since you're a scholar of corruption, Alina, you know very well that a lot of those regimes use and abuse financial and legal systems of the West to undermine Western economic institutions. And I think if we want to fix the system, we really need to make sure that the dirty money from these countries do not actually destroy the West, do not contribute to further polarization and lack of confidence in democratic institutions within the West. And I think this is one of the things that people overlooked, the rise of kleptocracies and the use of corrupt money to undermine the confidence in the West, and therefore bringing home the message that Russia is a corrupt and imperfect democracy, but the West is as well imperfect and corrupt. And so these are the tools they use, and I think complacency didn't allow the West to see how successful these tools can be. And I think now the West is waking up to this, and I'm actually optimistic on this.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much for this. So subversion, right? These people are subverting the old liberal democracies. But then for us who are old, I mean older, I guess, than the average age of people attending this conversation, we know that subversion existed prior to 1989, and that the Soviets in particular, they were doing it quite well. So subversion is really not a new thing. And of course, it is the economic crisis and the other reasons which, enfeebled the West. But what I'd like to stress a little bit, where I'd like to push a little bit the two of you, is what are the factors which made these countries like Russia, like China, like Turkey, in fact, stronger? It's not just the fact that they are stronger in relative terms, due to the fact that the West was hit by the economic crisis, but they are really stronger. I mean, in order to create banks which are alternative to the Bretton Woods institution, you really have to be able to afford to do so, right? You should also look, I mean, we live in Berlin. If you look around at the middle class from Russia living around here, it is really a very impressive Russian middle class, which seem to be doing very well. And I regret to say they do not seem to be very engaged politically. When there are demonstrations against Mr. Putin, I see very few people turned up, and most of them are students in democracy at VCB, Humboldt University, and Hertie. The same with demonstrations for press freedom over Turkey, although we have a very large Turkish community here, which I do not think Mr. Erdogan can touch. I mean, of course, they all have relatives in Turkey and whatever. So I think that both economically and politically, these countries are doing something which is successful, right? Economically successful, and politically they give them some grounds. Now, what are these? Because in the same way that subvert us, we really have to understand the grounds of their success if we want to subvert them. This is what I would suggest.
Well, I think we also need to understand the sources of weakness and division of the democracies, particularly the Western democracies. But hopefully we'll come back to that because I want to answer your question. I think it's best that Sergei speak about Russia, but a lot of the recent work I think is pointing toward certainly the strong argument, which Sergei can reply to, that Putin has been, despite his relentless kleptocracy and cynicism, a reasonably effective state builder. And there is in certain realms, real state capacity now, and the ability to project power, hard power, soft power, sharp power, various forms of power. There's been, among other things, we saw it in Syria. It threatens the Baltics to a degree that I think not enough people are paying nearly enough attention to, the resurgence of Russian military power. If China moves on Taiwan, which I think there is a growing danger of, and the US falls into a war with China, I think it is highly likely, not just possible, highly likely, that Putin will do to probably all three Baltic states what he did to Crimea and simply take them. What the hell? What's Europe going to do about it when the US is preoccupied? In the case of China, well, Alina, there's a lot you can do for yourself as an emerging superpower with roughly 40 years, nearly 40 years of 8 to 10% annual economic growth. And I might add, 8 to 10% annual economic growth that is not, mainly in contrast to Russia, based on natural resource extraction, but that's organic through, agricultural and industrial investment and some growth of entrepreneurship. So these are states that, in very different ways than Stalin and Mao, have used authoritarian power, or than Hitler, have used authoritarian power to modernize and build economic, organizational, political, internal, and geopolitical strength. The other thing I want to say is that they are states that have used technology, and particularly information and communication technology, very cleverly and successfully. This has enabled Putin to score some breathtaking asymmetric gains, particularly, in my view, in helping to elect Donald Trump in 2016, which was a seminal event in the decline of the quality of American democracy internally and the erosion of America's role in the world. And China has been, not only building an Orwellian surveillance state at home to guard against the danger of some future Tiananmen style movement, but it's been building the platform for 5G telecommunications around the world. It's been building other telecom infrastructure through the Belt and Road Initiative. It's been capturing masses of data in that respect. And it's rolling out a smart cities program that is got a very dangerous technological surveillance element to it. And it's now in the final stages of completing a central bank digital currency that, in contrast to the somewhat rare, ineffective, and episodic detachment from the SWIFT system of global payments clearing, and the US, therefore, ability to still dominate global payments and therefore successfully impose financial sanctions on a lot of bad actors, this new system of alternative payments in the yuan, the digital currency, I think is going to have a very significant corrosive effect on A, our ability to combat kleptocracy, B, our ability to pressure authoritarian regimes more generally, and C, our ability to contain China's malign influence around the world.
Sergei?
Yes, I agree with Larry. I would just add that when you talk about middle class in Berlin, that's a loss for Russia, right? So a lot of entrepreneurial and educated people left Russia exactly because Putin's model is not conducive to implementing their potential back at home. Whether they demonstrate against Putin or Erdogan, these people are actually showing that these regimes are doing something wrongly. And as I mentioned, we can compare quality of life in different countries, but the ultimate measure is vote with their feet. People move to the West Coast of the United States and not the vice versa, because that's where the innovation and quality of life is, and people prefer to live in democracies. That is still a fact. Whatever we say about the success of Chinese model, China is not loved around the world, and people don't move to China. And that is a huge difference between the soft power of the West and the soft power of autocracies. People value not just the incomes that liberal democracies provide. And I remind you that if you look at prosperous countries around the world, China is not one of them yet. It's still a middle-income country. There are only two kinds of rich countries which are not democratic. There are oil-rich monarchies where you have so much oil per capita then incomes are high, and there are like 6 of them, right? And Singapore. And these are just the 2 exceptions. And in that sense, the attraction of the West is not fully lost. Now, on the question from Larry, I think it's a great question. Putin has been extremely successful economically in the first 10 years, maybe first 14 years of his rule. And then the growth started to slow down exactly because Putin was building a kleptocratic regime based on the state intervention, exactly because middle class was started to leave and being unhappy. And then the growth slowed down, and then Putin took Crimea. And that, I think, worked extremely well, probably even better than he himself expected. And that is something related to imperial nostalgia, where apparently annexing Crimea supported Putin's popularity beyond belief. This effect now has faded away, and Putin is facing difficult choices. And I fully agree with Larry that that may actually push him into the direction of grabbing more land. So we should all be scared. But what is true is economic growth has stopped. Today, real incomes of Russian households are 10% below the level of 2013. So if you think about a democracy in which there is such a protracted stagnation, of course, the incumbents would be out of the office. Putin is an extremely skillful politician, combining geopolitical narratives, combining censorship, targeted repression Russia is still not Soviet Union. There are hundreds of political prisoners, but not thousands yet. Yet Putin is very skillful in using all of those. And I fully agree with Larry that we live in the world in which you have very cheap asymmetric responses. There could be cyber attacks, which are extremely cheap, disinformation efforts, which are extremely cheap. You need to grab Crimea. You don't need to have million soldiers. It's enough to have 20,000 soldiers, right? So these are the things that Putin does extremely well, but it doesn't mean that he can't stand up to the United States in terms of economic might and in terms of actually technological might as well. And this is where I think China is different from Russia. China is a real challenger. Russia can produce a lot of unhappiness and undermine the West here and there, but Russia is not challenging the West in a way that China does. And I think people should worry about Russia. Russia should not be neglected, but Russia and China are completely different.
Yeah, but what if Russia and China, come together as they frequently do in the Security Council? I mean, that is really the problem, that they can be complementary. So I think you already offered.
And they are joined by Iran and Turkey. There are many non-democratic players around the world, Alina. But if you think about what the situation was 50 years ago, when Spain was non-democratic, Taiwan, we talk about Taiwan. Taiwan was a one-party military regime. Portugal was not democratic. Greece was a military junta, and we don't even talk about Latin America. So the world has improved.
No, I fully agree with you that you are, that you won the cold peace, and I did. Okay, so I'm more worried for people who come after us, to be very honest. But I want to push further on these economic solutions before we move to the political solutions. I think that's what you said about money laundering and all this subversion of the West through banks, for instance. I think that's very important, and not, I would say that nearly nothing is done considering how important the threat is and what could actually be done. So let's say that this is one direction. But what about the fact that this, that we allowed this political capitalism model countries, as Branko Milanovic calls them, into globalization? Didn't this actually change the global market forever? The fact that you have actors who actually do not play by market rules. And is there a solution to this, or are we going to continue? I mean, yes, Trump was, of course, I don't think anybody disagrees, Trump was a wild guy, but wasn't he actually trying to solve a real problem about this? And is there any way of addressing this problem? Can we come up also with some economic solutions in the same way that, my Harvard economics professors like Jeffrey Sachs always said that economists won the Cold War because it's them who came up with the plan to bankrupt the Soviet Union by arming it too much, okay? So who are the similar thinkers of our age who come up with plans for globalization to bankrupt these people, or at least to prevent them from winning so much more, from actually not playing by the rules against the West?
Well, Alina, there are no simple solutions, and the reason is in '89 the West thought, let's integrate the East, and the East will become like the West. And to a great extent, Central and Eastern Europe has done that. There are problems in every Central and Eastern European country, as you know, but these are mostly European countries now, high-income countries with imperfect democracies, some of them with well-functioning democracies, but these countries have integrated. And then the next question was about China. And the West also thought China will become part of the global system and will eventually become like the West. But as you rightly said, China has become a capitalist economy, but not a democracy. And moreover, as I mentioned, what happened, the West has become a bit like the East. The West has become a bit more corrupt. The West has become more polarized. And one of the reasons for that was the lack of common enemy, right? During the Cold War, the West had an existential threat and had a common project to survive the Cold War, to win the Cold War. Today, China is not an existential threat in the sense that China is not trying to destroy physically the West. The common project is climate. And so the climate change is a project which actually makes it impossible to isolate China. If you want to fight climate change, you need to do it together with non-democratic countries as well. And that makes it so much harder. Finally, China is not Soviet Union in the sense that China is so much more integrated in trade, investment, in everything, not just in climate. And so to isolate China today is impossible. You can isolate Russia, you can isolate Iran, you can isolate Turkey, but you cannot really isolate China anymore simply because interdependence is so large. And in that sense, I think solutions are not easy, but they exist. And I think first and foremost, you need to put your own house in order. These things that we mentioned about enablers of autocratic kleptocracies in the West. Second, of course, is enforce the rules of international organizations. Don't be naive anymore. So you mentioned Trump addressing the real problems. Yes, the real problem was China was not playing by the rules of World Trade Organization. And on this, people who like Trump or dislike Trump, they all agreed on this. And so the West should get together and try to restore a rule-based system in whatever way they can. China is trying to abuse Interpol and almost succeeded, right? So these issues are also very, very important. So in that sense, stop being naive, try to reclaim at least some leadership in the international organizations, which are still very, very important.
Okay, that's your second solution. That's your second solution. Larry, please, you started. Go ahead.
The problem is that China is trying very aggressively and very skillfully with a new generation of extremely articulate in English, well-prepared, wolf warrior-minded diplomats to rewrite the rules of the international order in telecommunications, with regard to the internet, in global finance, and so on. And so if we want to reassert the principle of a rules-based international order, which I strongly endorse Sergei's sentiment in that regard, we have to be sure that that they remain rules that are, are faithful to the founding liberal principles of human rights, freedom, transparency, and so on, an open and interoperable internet, all of the things that Russia and China, and as you noted, Sergei, it was an important insight, the other authoritarian powers in the world that are rallying around this kind of loose global authoritarian coalition, that they are increasingly trying to advocate against in international forums. And I would say there's now some urgency on the economic front, Alina, in a few respects, and I'll just note them in bullet form since I know our time is not unlimited. One is we must stay technologically nimble, adroit, and competitive in terms of the evolution of global finance. We cannot allow the neo-totalitarian People's Republic of China to establish a central bank digital currency that then becomes the predominant platform for cashless, frictionless transactions in the world, undermining the SWIFT system. Whether that means that the US should establish its own central bank digital currency or or one or more private sector alternatives, I don't know yet. I don't think that there's consensus on that. But Europe and the United States must respond to this in ways that retain, I think, the global leadership for the dollar and for liberal international values and international finance. We're going to need a new generation of more muscular anti-kleptocracy rules and initiatives, because you know this well, Alina, every time you develop a set of rules about real name transactions in real estate or business registration and so on, you get a new layer of sophistication to evade. So I think we need an anti-kleptocracy 2.0 initiative. And one other thing before we go on, I really want to stress is that I think one of the major contributing factors to the plight we are in is that economic inequality within nations has gotten dramatically worse almost everywhere, and certainly in the United States in particular, because we don't have quite the same ability to level the inequality from pre-tax income the way that most European democracies do. And so we have to become much more innovative, much more assertive, much more committed to reducing economic inequality and to generating a fair and inclusive array of new opportunities for intergenerational mobility and for living a decent and secure physical life, or the descent of people's material lives into insecurity is going to drive them into populism.
Yeah, I see. I'd like to encourage students actually to use the chat form more, to start putting questions. We're also watching the questions on Facebook, and we're going to put them here in the flow of the conversation. Well, listening to this, I'm thinking that the West was not very good at fighting through international organizations during the Cold War, was it? In fact, I thought that that Soviet Union was very, very successful at the time. And if you look at a number of, instances at the UN and the isolation that you see sometimes of United States, I just cannot be very optimistic that that's the way. I mean, we won the Cold War, but we didn't win it through international organizations. So let me try to push you a little bit on other political solutions, right? Even if we take some comfort on the fact that some countries actually prove they are consolidated democracies and they seem to resist this backslide, there are many places where democracy activists feel very alone these days after Afghanistan. Very alone and rather convinced that the cavalry is not going to come anymore to their rescue because there is no cavalry. And what can we do for these people? I mean, how should this democracy promotion industry change so to continue to offer some support and some backup to democracy fighters everywhere, but not subvert them? Because we have seen in Russia and in other places, even in my own country, we are all labeled as, George Soros sort of puppets, and that is not an easy thing to fight. I think that we succeeded to survive this, but we have been through ages, really, of attacks over this, and one can build a very successful career just by denouncing the George Soros democracy movement in a country. So having external support is, sometimes a blessing, but sometimes can actually lead to major subversion. So what can we do as outside actors to help democracy activists? How should this movement change from now on? And what are the plans, really? I mean, for instance, what are the plans of the Biden administration, which came with very strong plans originally? I read the anti-corruption documents in draft, but now I ask myself, is this going to go on? Is this actually realistic and possible?
Yeah, I can't speak for the Biden administration. Certainly the run-up to and the planning for the Democracy Summit, which will initially in December be a virtual summit, I think has gotten mired in the predictable interagency, wrestling, and I'm afraid is at risk of being rather ground down in its vision and impact. But we do continue, mainly through the United States and Europe, to provide quite a lot of assistance, governmental and non-governmental, to Democrats around the world. And I think the concern that recipients of this assistance voiced about a dozen years ago when we surveyed them at the National Endowment for Democracy, the concerns remain, to my mind, valid today. The bureaucracy associated with the flows of these money and the overhead costs of, reporting need to be a little bit streamlined, at least so there can be common reporting standards. Obviously, you need accountability, or corruption will seep in on the civil society side. The more that these recipients can have multiple sources of funding, the more they can at least develop a little bit of immunity from the charge that they're just captives of George Soros or the United States or whoever it might be. And it would help if we could get other actors in the game, other national actors in the game. I'd like to see, there is a European Endowment for Democracy, but I think it'd be a good thing if other European democracies individually could build up their capacities for assistance in this regard. Germany is an exception because it's the original player here with its party Stiftungen that still play in a very important role. Finally, Alina, a very important message that came out from that survey we did of democracy assistance recipients about a dozen years ago is, I think, the most important one. They want to see more interaction, more reinforcement of the assistance flows being backed by the diplomacy of the democracies. So, we give these grants to these actors, and then their autocrats beat the crap out of them and lock them up. And, what good have we done? So we need to lean harder morally through soft power and in terms of hard consequences and assistance flows. The problem is that this is much harder to do than it was a dozen years ago because China and Russia are stronger, we are weaker, and our ability to sanction is eroded.
Okay, so sanctions for Belarus. I had a guest a few years ago in a democracy promotion class from an international development organization who was crossing basically every week with nearly all the money for the Belarus civil society in his trunk. Okay, and I guess that he can no longer do this now. Okay, so maybe, more sanctions, blacklisting officials from Belarus or things like that might be more help. Sergei, you have
it's got to be very broad. Sanctions have to be very broadly committed to by, a broad international alliance of democracies in the world. Sorry to interrupt you.
Okay, so targeted sanctions, where these days we're, targeting on individuals more, like Magnitsky-like kind of sanctions, but broader alliances behind the sanctions. That's the ticket that we're trying to enact. Not easy, but yes, it does seem like that's a good way to go. Sergei, tell us a little bit. You had to leave Russia, didn't you? I mean, you were an academic and university manager in Russia, but you had to leave, and it's very difficult, notoriously difficult, to give external help to democracy activists in Russia, where this is held against them. So what can be done? What can diasporas do? Could diasporas be a way, since there are so many, these days, so many people abroad who hopefully, as you said, share democratic values? Is this the external help which could tip the balance and could help a little bit, or what could we do?
Alina, I fully share your concerns that people who get money from Soros are blamed as foreign agents in all these countries. And actually in Russia today, Soros is announced to be undesirable. Soros foundations are announced to be undesirable organizations. It's like Harry Potter book. It's literally called undesirable. So if you take money from Soros, you can go to jail eventually. The same is true of NED and EED, National Endowment for Democracy, European Endowment for Democracy, which probably recognizes their contribution to democracy around the world. I would, by the way, say that EED seems to be more nimble, probably because it's a younger organization than its American counterparts, and people who receive money from EED, European Endowment for Democracy, do say that this organization works quite flexibly and quickly. So overall, I would support the story about the argument about the sanctions. And the West needs to cooperate on the sanctions, which has improved a lot in recent years, but also be very serious and commit resources. It takes effort and human resources to go after accounts of dictators and their friends. And you mentioned Belarus. Of course, President Lukashenko, or former President Lukashenko, depends how you count, doesn't have an account in New York City. He probably has an account in a Middle Eastern bank in Emirates. But this Middle Eastern bank would be extremely upset if United States imposed sanctions on the bank, which has happened before. In France, one of the major banks violated American sanctions regimes and had to pay $9 billion in compensation. So these kind of tools, until yuan rules the world, still today the West has enormous power to make sure that banks who want to do business in global economy don't touch dictators' money. And I think just commitment of some resources is very much needed for this. Now you're asking what we can do for democratic opposition, for democracy activists around the world. So giving them money indeed is problematic, but giving them training now is as easy as ever with online tools, especially after pandemic. And this is what diaspora does now. And until YouTube is blocked, actually a lot of stuff is going on through this. And we know that people who study in American universities come back with more support for democracy. There is actually a study by an economist who now works at IMF, Antonia Spillenberger, which shows that quantitatively. And I think if you do that online, a lot can happen. Now, this brings me to the most important point, the technology. Technology makes it much easier and cheaper to stand against non-democratic regimes. You don't need as much money if you have social networks, in particular YouTube, and new secure messengers. And so the problem is to make sure that Western tech giants do not cooperate with non-democratic regimes, do not submit to non-democratic regimes. And unfortunately, as we now know from Facebook papers, they occasionally do. Unfortunately, as we know from recent experience of September parliamentary election in Russia, Google and Apple actually submitted to Russia's request to remove Navalny's app from their application stores. There was some hostage taken, literally hostage taken. Russian government said that they would arrest Google and Apple employees on the ground. Twitter didn't have employees, so Twitter didn't submit to the request. But this is the battleground. And this is where American government can actually tell the big tech companies that the priorities are this and not that. So I remind you a story when McKinsey in Moscow told its employees, do not go to protests against Putin. And so then a senator in the United States, Senator Rubio, wrote to McKinsey in the United States and asked McKinsey to what extent they value American market more than Russian market. And McKinsey in Moscow apologized and actually withdrew this letter, saying, of course, according to Russian constitution, every person, including McKinsey staff, can go to peaceful protests. And so this is the mechanism and this is the tool. If United States wants to promote democracy, it needs to make sure that its companies are not accomplices of non-democratic regimes. And I think this is doable. This is still very much doable, especially if the US joins forces with other democracies. And I think this needs to be done because it is much more important than money. This technology really makes democratic activism now cheaper and more effective. But if there is no access to non-censored technological tools, then it is a completely different game. It's much harder to win.
So that leads us to a totally different array of solutions where I think that you are right. I mean, you're opening a door which needs to be open, which is how do we make this technology giant actually allies instead of being the rather neutral players that they have been. And being neutral, they actually allowed trolls to come in and beat the teenager girls with white flowers. This is how the internet have looked like in the past 10 years, right? So we need to do something to turn social media to our advantage. In other words, to empower Democrats and to eliminate violence, bullying, and all this on the social media. Well, but can we do something? I mean, are these giants, are they going to cooperate with us, in particular, since we are after them, fining them for all kind of market problems? And is it not easier for them to do what they already do, to comply with China or other countries' demand, and in fact treat the whole world as a market, not an arena for democracy promotions? I mean, should we be hopeful in this? Are there initiatives which show that that we're going in the good direction?
Well, I think there are multiple tools to regulate big tech, for sure. And if you look at big tech CEOs talking to U.S. Congress, you see how scared big tech CEOs are. And it's just a lack of clarity on what U.S. finds acceptable and what U.S. doesn't like, such as being an accomplice in censorship, say in Vietnam. These things need to be discussed openly, and I think choices need to be made. And we should remember that non-democratic regimes are not just dangerous for themselves, they're also dangerous for the West, for the reasons we've been discussing today.
I think we need a more radical approach to big tech than most of what is being discussed. These companies have so much power and so much concentration of market presence that they have become, I think, a threat to American democracy, but to democracy more generally. Within the United States, I have come to think we need to somehow, and it's going to be very complicated, bring the tools of antitrust litigation to bear to break up Facebook's oligopolistic and in many ways monopolistic place in the social media sphere, and probably Google as well. I think that they need, we don't have a model of regulation for social media companies. They're not television broadcasters, they're not newspapers. They are certainly publishers of content that I think need to bear greater responsibility for what they're not only publishing, but elevating and promoting through their cynical and profit-driven algorithms. Just look at the article in the New York Times on what this is meaning for society and democracy in one big country, India. So I think there needs to be a lot of innovative thought to how regulation can happen. But I will say that even though I was part of the discussions that led to the creation of the Facebook Oversight Board and have a lot of respect for the people on it, one of the co-chairs is a Stanford colleague of mine and a great legal scholar and former federal judge, Michael McConnell. And so I admire their work. I think it should continue, but I don't think it's adequate. I think we have entered a period where we need, very, very far-reaching regulation of the big social media tech giants in very creative ways. And we've got to confront the really severe damage that their business model is doing, not only to democracy, but to, you know, peace and tolerance in societies around the world.
Right. So let me ask you the final question, which is, what should people do? I mean, what should democracy activists in these countries that we agreed are the most difficult cases? This is why, you know, they are left still struggling, like people in Belarus or people in Algeria, and definitely the context is less favorable than it was. So what can one do when context is wrong? What are the kind of actions that we can do? Because let's think that context was wrong before, okay, and democracy activists in the 70s and 80s did something until the window of opportunity appeared, and then they became, you know, like Václav Havel presidents, and they took over their government. What should one do in bad times to promote democracy in a country like Belarus or Egypt? What could we tell these people?
Well, don't lose hope. That's the first thing. And that sounds trivial, but it's not. These things run in cycles. So I think keeping hope alive, keeping themselves alive, and returning to some of the techniques of living in truth and organizing in the underground, um, you know, might be necessary. I think going back to reading Václav Havel and understanding how dissidents had to organize in the, you know, dark interstices of semi-totalitarian societies, that there's some of that. We need to teach them safety in the digital age, that they have to be very careful about the digital imprints they leave. We need to work with them to develop tools of digital operation that give them more anonymity and safety in communicating. We need to help people understand that there may be a role for people to organize from exile. Some people, frankly, have no hope of being able to operate on the ground in these places, and help them think about how to stay engaged and focused on the democratic struggle, even if they have to do it from abroad. This is a big challenge now in Burma. And I think we need, through various networks like the World Movement for Democracy and the small programs we're trying to do, like our Draper Hill Summer Fellows program at Stanford, to keep them connected to one another and learning from one another, which will also give them practical ideas of resistance and advocacy, possibly some new tools as well, but also just give them hope and solidarity. Hope and solidarity are very important things in difficult times.
Well, thank you very much for these thoughts. Sergei, any final words for people who are
No,
in
I
Russia?
actually fully agree with Larry. I fully agree with Larry. I think what we definitely know is there is no way you can bring troops and install democracy. Democracy has to be owned by the people and obtained by the people from within. And indeed, if the context is wrong, what you can do is you can engage with democratic activists, support them, probably not financially, but more in terms of skills and dialogue that Larry has mentioned. And of course, put your own house in order, which will also directly and indirectly help democracy promotion cause. If I put this question that you asked me in front of opposition leader Alexei Navalny, he would always tell me the West should respect its own laws, meaning fighting money laundering, fighting anti-corruption, and that will help to bring change to Russia, and that will help also defend the Western democratic institutions itself. And this is what we've already been discussed in the last hour.
Yes, splendid. So keep our own standards, because people want to emulate what is good if they believe it is really good and it is really the golden standard here. And for the rest, to the democracy activists who might hear us, keep safe, don't take unnecessary risk. look at what others do, learn. Windows of opportunities do exist, and they will come your way, and we will do the best to support you. Thanks everybody, to people on Zoom, to people on Facebook, to people who put questions. Thanks in particular to our wonderful speakers for this conversation of tonight, and see everybody in another month's time for our next conversation with Tom Carothers and Richard Youngs on the differences in democracy promotion between United States and Europe today. Thank you and stay well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So great to be with you.